German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has warned that any easing of oil sanctions on Russia by the United States in order to tackle surging energy costs caused by the conflict in the Middle East would be a mistake. Speaking on a visit to Norway, Merz said any such move would help fund Moscow's ongoing war against Ukraine and should be avoided.
6 members of the G7 expressed a very clear view that this is not the right signal to send. We learned this morning that the US government has apparently decided otherwise. Once again, we believe this is the wrong decision. There is currently a price problem, but not a supply problem. And in that regard, I would like to know what additional motives led the US government to make this decision.
DW's chief political editor Michael Küfner was in Norway for that. So, Michael, how unusual is it for a German chancellor to openly question a US sanctions decision like this?
Well, it's becoming increasingly the kind of, not day-to-day, but the way that Friedrich Merz is choosing to handle decisions by Donald Trump. I just want to recap that there was a G7 phone call where 6 of the 7 members appear to have left that call under the impression that Donald Trump would not go ahead and lift those sanctions very temporarily, also very limited on oil, only oil that's already on vessels around the world. But this caught the other 6 by surprise. And that in itself is a problem, that the G7 cannot come to a conclusion that is then stuck by the US president. And then, of course, there is this growing risk for Ukraine. And I was traveling with the German defense minister and the chancellor, and the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, went even further. He said he was very concerned that this would be to the disadvantage of Ukraine, that this now bolsters the position of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. He told us journalists, as we were there at a NATO exercise, he said that what it takes to get Putin back to the negotiating table over Ukraine would be to reduce his income on oil, and that this is doing the exact opposite. So this is as open a clash between the Europeans, here specifically the Germans and the US president, as you are going to get. But the reality is, and that is also recognized at this end, that he can just go ahead and do this. And everybody is waiting with bated breath whether he will leave the Middle East region in pieces and leave everybody else to bear the brunt of that and also pay the costs that we're already seeing in the international economy.
Yeah, Europe has certainly become used to Trump's unilateral actions. Now, the German chancellor also called for a convincing plan for an end to the Iran war. That's another very pointed criticism of the Trump administration, isn't it?
This is a strategy that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has chosen to take, not to oppose Donald Trump directly, but to question the logic. And we've also seen this now on the unilateral decision by Donald Trump to temporarily suspend those sanctions on Russian oil. Here he said he wants to know which reasons brought the US government to take this step. And on Iran, although he stopped short of criticizing this as violating international law, only speaking of a, quote, dilemma here, so clearly he was not convinced. He just said that he wants to see a plan for day one. This is not just a strategy, though. We're hearing from government sources as well that, of course, the Germans, the Europeans are not just speaking to Israel and the United States over Iran. They're speaking to many partners in the region, and that there's a growing sentiment that this is really sorely lacking. What exactly will happen when there is a decision? And Donald Trump seems to see this as, again, a unilateral decision by him to end this war with the incoming ruler in Iran, who hasn't really been seen in public yet properly, but he's already announced that he would use the Strait of Hormuz as essentially a way to negotiate, keeping that stranglehold that Iran currently has. We know there are lots of mines there, and that is where 20% of the world's oil needs to pass through. So that means even if the supply is safe for the Europeans, that the prices will remain high, and that's a huge problem.
Now, Merz also said that pressure on Moscow must increase, but are there any concrete steps that we can expect in the coming days?
That's the problem. And this is what the Europeans really need to figure out over the weekend. Friedrich Merz is planning to have a phone call with Emmanuel Macron to strategize. There's an EU summit coming up next week. That will be very interesting, whether the Europeans can come up with a strategy and, most importantly, all be on the same page. Of course, there is at least Hungary under Viktor Orban, the prime minister, that seems to side with the Americans and with the Russians, taking turns there on various issues. And this is a huge challenge now for the Europeans to show that, once again, they won't just react, that they can be active and take a line towards Donald Trump, which one must say they have done in the past over the issue of Greenland. That is no longer an issue between the Europeans and the US for now.
And a final question before I let you go. We've seen the relationship between Washington and the European Union grow increasingly tense as the years have progressed. So are we seeing a serious rift finally emerging between Europe and the United States now?
Look, the rift is already there, but when you speak to people below the absolute top level in the United States, below the Minister of War, Pete Hegseth, and the Trump's inner circle, they will freely admit that it is also in the strategic interest of the United States to have control over the Arctic, to be in charge in Europe, to also push Russia back if necessary. So the big question is, once the dust settles on all of this action Donald Trump is taking, will he then identify strategic interests of the United States beyond what his own personal agenda seems to be at this moment in time? And that for now really is an open question, but it's clear that the Europeans, although they completely rule out fighting in the Middle East region, certainly Germany is completely ruling that out for itself, but their interests are also at stake in the Middle East, and more directly over the expected lack of support for Ukraine, not just from the United States, but in particular when it comes to weapon supplies to Ukraine.
All right, that was DW Chief Political Editor Michael Küfner. Thanks for joining us. Benjamin Schmidt has served as European Energy Security Advisor to the U.S. State Department. He's currently with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and he's also a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. So, Benjamin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be on Deutsche Welle.
So, do you think that the German Chancellor is right that relaxing sanctions now risks undermining Western leverage over Russia?
Absolutely. I think Chancellor Merz is absolutely correct to say that this is a wrong move, as he said, by the Trump White House to relax sanctions, even if temporarily, on Russia's oil supplies. I think we have to remember this is an administration that has basically held every option in its pocket to put pressure on the Russian Federation. And there's a lot of speculation that this current general license from the U.S. Department of the Treasury that's supposed to only be, quote unquote, temporary and extend through April 11th, that could easily be extended beyond that, given Trump's willingness to try to play with sanctions on the Russian Federation to make up for the current spike in oil prices. So I think that there's a lot of concern that this will not only be bad messaging vis-a-vis the Russian Federation, it also could be something that could be longer term, and that would be absolutely disastrous to transatlantic unity on Russia sanctions.
Now, Merz argues that the world is facing an oil price spike and not a supply shortage. If that's the case, does easing Russian oil sanctions actually solve the problem?
I think he's right. And I think that, what we've seen so far, so we've seen this announcement go out yesterday, and there hasn't been a significant change in the global oil price, the Brent price, the WTI. We're around $100 a barrel, and it hasn't really changed a lot based on this move. I think that this was a cunning move by Kirill Dmitriev, the special envoy that's been meeting with Witkoff and Jared Kushner and others in Florida recently to try to get back on what the Russians want to do, which is to get to sanctions relief without doing much of anything to earn that. In other words, not getting out of Ukraine, not getting towards a ceasefire, and certainly not doing anything that would reverse its trajectory of putting pressure in terms of hybrid threats on the transatlantic community writ large, and that means Europe outside of Ukraine.
So if I understand you correctly, you think that by changing the status quo on the sanctions regime it's a move that kind of risks weakening the Western resolve on Russia in general when it comes to sanctions and them earning money that they can then project into Ukraine?
Well, that's absolutely the case. Obviously, the Russians are already earning money from their oil supplies through their shadow fleet, right? They've been setting up this underinsured kind of low quality equipment in terms of ships to ship their oil, their Urals crude oil around the world, and that's started to actually been cracked down on, not only by the United States with some interdictions, but we've seen more and more interdictions around Europe. We saw 2 this week from Sweden. There's been interdictions in the North Sea. So this is really something that was gaining traction to put pressure on the Kremlin, and right in time to intervene on that is this waiver. And frankly, I keep comparing it to the waiver that the Biden administration had on the Nord Stream 2 construction back in 2021. That was something that was a mistake then. It gave a green light to Putin, I think, to some extent, to increase his aggression and ultimately leads, to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine just months later after that decision. But we're now after we know better now, right? Russia has already invaded Ukraine for at a large scale for 4 years and continues to rain destruction. So we really can't have that sort of message to the Kremlin at all, even if it's to try to politically balance the oil price, which again, it hasn't really had that sort of impact.
Now, of course, we have to turn to what Russia has said about this move. And the Russian Foreign Office has said that the easing of sanctions proves its point that Russian oil is needed to maintain energy security around the world. Is there any truth to that?
No, I mean, no, this is the Russian line. This is something that we have been going on for some time. If the Straits of Hormuz were not closed, then Russia would really not be needed in that baseline oil supply situation, because as you said earlier in the segment, Chancellor Merz has pointed out that the supplies are there. It's just the price that's spiking. It's reacting to these sort of geopolitical and security situation related headlines, including that's which is going on in the Straits of Hormuz right now, whether it be targeting of ships, the Iranian laying of sea mines that's been reported, these sort of things. And look, this is where the United States Congress has to step in. There is something called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, that was passed in 2017, and it has in it a clause, Section 216, which says if the White House, any White House after this was passed, tries to significantly change its posture on sanctions or policy towards the Russian Federation, then Congress would have to basically approve that going forward. So I know that the Senate has not done a lot in terms of holding the White House to account on its foreign policy moves vis-a-vis Russia. Now is the time to use sanctions oversight from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and from the House as well, but really to make sure that the White House is if they're going to have this short-term waiver, it only goes through April 11th. And frankly, it shouldn't have happened at all, but there we are.
Let's focus for a second again on the transatlantic relationship. Now, do you think we're seeing deeper divisions come to shine over between the allies in Europe and North America over how they should be handling Russia?
I mean, I think we've been there for quite some time. There's been divisions within Europe. Obviously, we've continued to see the bickering between the EU and Hungary and Slovakia, and obviously the back and forth between Ukraine and Hungary in particular. This does nothing for NATO unity, for transatlantic unity, and at the same time, we're also looking at where does Washington stand in all of this? As it was, we were in a very poor place before with the quote unquote peace negotiations that have been going on that have led to absolutely nothing except for giving more diplomatic top cover and credence to the Kremlin and getting nothing for Witkoff and Kushner in return. And we really need to get back to leading on this. The U.S., if we talk about peace through strength, the White House talks a lot about peace through strength. We need to actually put pressure on the Kremlin through sanctions, through technology export controls, through interdicting the shadow fleet, and through calling out all of the other sort of malign activities, including offshore and onshore sabotage, physical sabotage against energy and critical infrastructure that the Russians have been up to for the past several years in Europe and around the world. So this is the sort of thing that we should have unity. We don't right now, but we need to get that back, and that's going to require some leadership in Washington, whether that's the Senate pushing the White House coming to that realization on its own, or the Europeans trying to get the White House on board. This is the time that Jean Monnet's vision of a Europe that is fully integrated and a partner of the United States. That's where this needs to come in.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was Benjamin Schmidt from the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you very much for your expertise.
Thanks so much.
Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.